everybody. How are y'all doing today? You get all right after lunch, so hopefully you're not too tired. I saw they had iced tea to keep those folks that need caffeine. So my name is Paul Argiry, and today we're going to be talking about avoiding the pitfalls of capitalizing software in an agile world. But before we kind of get deep into some of that, there's two external factors that are impacting technology space today. And one of those is as a service. It's a service that could improve your business agility, could reduce your costs, and speed up your implementation of your development. Who would be interested in that type of service? Everyone interested in that? Does anyone know what that service is? No? Well, the service is the cloud. And according to a 2016 Forrester software survey, that of those that participated, the number one reason that they moved to the cloud was to improve their business agility. And when we talk about business agility, this is really taking your data, turning it into usable information so you can make better business decisions with it. That was number one reason. Number two was it's going to reduce your overall cost. McKinsey just came out just recently and said people that move to cloud platforms reduce their cost 30 to 40%, which is big, right? That's a big number. And the third top reason was speed of implementation, right? Look how easy it is to access the cloud these days. Sometimes a person can get their own software as a service. If a developer wants to go and build their platform as a service and kind of build an application right on top of that, they can go out to the various cloud providers that have those PaaS solutions and quickly start working on an application. So the cloud is powerful. And when we're talking about the cloud, we're talking about all of it. We're talking about software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. We're talking about all of it, right? So that's one thing that's happening in the market today. It's impacting technology. The other thing that's impacting it is because of this access to the cloud and how easy it is. According to IDC, a spending survey that they had done back in 2016, that by 2019, 18 months from now, almost half of global technology purchases are going to be done by non-IT users, right? This is the business. This is your marketing folks. This is your customer solution or customer service, sales folks, just able to go off and procure their own IT at will. That's substantial. So these two things are happening today, right? So we have the cloud's very easy. People are starting to have that access, direct access, to go make the purchases on their purchases on their own. So of course they're ready, right? They want to start on this journey. We want to get moving down this path. And hey, let's start, let's go build this application, let's go be agile, let's go do all those cool things. And one of the things that you want to make sure you do along this journey, before you go too fast and too far, is make sure you bring along your finance and accounting folks. Because if you don't bring your finance and accounting folks along, they're going to be very uncertain what's going on. Why are we changing what we've historically done? And so what's going to happen is when they're dealt with uncertainty, when they're done the unknown, what are they going to do? They're going to block you, right? They're going to say, time out, I don't understand. This is not within Sarbanes-Oxley. This isn't the rules we normally follow. We've done certain things a certain way. I'm not used to this. And so they're going to block you, right? And they also have the control of the budget, right? They have the purse strings of how things kind of work. So this is definitely one of the first pitfalls you want to avoid. Now, how do I know so much about that side? Well, guilty as charged. I am a CPA, by background. I started school at the University of Florida back in 1987, got my bachelor's and master's in accounting. And when I graduated in 1992, of course I'm kind of dating myself here, that's when it was called Price Waterhouse, before it became Price Waterhouse Coopers, so many moons ago. And I got into public accounting and did audits for companies. And over the next 25 plus years, got into corporate finance and treasury, mergers and acquisitions, financial due diligence. Worked several companies in industry. Red Hat's the open source infrastructure software company where I was the VP and treasurer. And then the last 2 years, I've been the Chief Financial Officer for LeadingAgile and really kind of get more on the development side versus the infrastructure side. And so I have a lot of accounting and finance background to kind of draw upon. Okay? So what are we going to cover today? Well, the first thing we're going to talk about the accounting for software development costs, and this is going to be there's multiple models under US GAAP, and we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about the various methods to track your costs. Then we're going to break into table groups, just a little bit more kind of stacked. We're going to figure out how to do this. Can't really divide the room in half. It's kind of leaning more this way, but we'll figure that out. And then do a table exercise talking about the pros and cons of story points versus time tracking. And then we'll talk about an alternative you may want to consider, which is capitalizing costs based on a features completed methodology. And then we'll also talk about once you have these costs capitalized, what do you do with them? We have to amortize them over time. And then we'll circle back to the impact of the cloud, which then impacts two more aspects within accounting. There's cloud accounting as well as website development costs. And then we'll touch upon this to have your balance of making sure you don't underinvest or overinvest. There's this 20% rule that we'll talk about. And then we'll just finish up about a capitalization opportunity for something you need to kind of consider and think about. So that's what we're going to cover today. So software development, we've talked about, the cloud has made this really easy. There's access is just, swiping your credit card, and you can go off and start building your platforms. And for those that have historically been in a waterfall environment, which has been a long time, your finance and accounting folks are going to say, wait a minute, we understand under waterfall, we can set a budget up, it's a set amount of time, I can understand that. We move into an agile environment, what does that mean? There's continual iterations of the software, it's getting deployed. Sometimes releases are happening very frequently. Does that mean because of this constant iteration we have to expense everything? Or how do I track this? Back in waterfall, I have time tracking. Everyone knows how to use that. There's these things called story points. Can we use that? Can we not use that? How do I do that? And then, so all these things are going to be kind of talked about. We're going to be covering today. So to kind of level set, when we're talking about capitalization, there's two ways a company can treat an outlay of cash. Okay. One way is when you outlay a cash is you expense it immediately. That charge goes into a company's income statement. This would be maybe a rent, utility bills, maybe weekly payroll, because that service is being consumed and used right away. There's no future economic benefit. On the other hand, for an outlay of cash, you have a capital asset. You buy a building. You really can't consume a building in a day or a week, so you're going to use that building for a long period of time. And what you do is you record that building or car or piece of equipment onto your balance sheet, a different financial statement, your balance sheet, and over a period of time as you use that and gain that benefit of that asset, you record a periodic charge for a building at depreciation. So the whole idea is to match up, it's a matching of the service you're getting for the expense with either that benefit or the revenue that you're matching with if you're selling your software. And so software, we're going to be capitalizing these assets because we're going to use that software hopefully for a longer period of time. It's not going to be consumed right away. And that's why these costs to develop it are being capitalized. Now we're going to start off to kind of level set, talk about two different types of software development costs. One is internal use. This is going to be software that's going to be used by the business, right? This is going to be an internal payroll system you may have generated. This may be a time tracking system, some other system. Think of financial institutions, these trading platforms that they build, or a bank and e-banking, electronic banking. Those are the type of things because it's going to be either used by the company or used by its customers. They're not selling it, to make money. That's not their business model. It's just it's inherent to their business. And so I'm only going to provide a couple of accounting references, but I think it's important to have. The first one is ASC, which stands for Accounting Standards Codification 350-40. Now for the old timers in the group that may be a little bit longer in tooth, that was under SOP 98-1. Okay? That's internal use software. On the other side, you have software to be sold, leased, or marketed. Their business model is to make money selling software. That's sort of selling a license. So this was back in the day, this talks about Microsoft. You had Oracle, SAP, those type of companies would fall into this. Their guidance is ASC 985-20, formerly known as FASB 86. So those are the two types of software that are out there. We'll start off talking about internal use, and then we'll move and talk about to be sold. So the accountants, when they came up with 3 stages for internal use software. The first stage is called the preliminary project stage. This is really where you're setting up your diligence, right? You're trying to figure out, what are my business requirements? Am I going to buy this or am I going to build this? This is where I'm going to bring in all the various vendors and do the dog and pony show, right? You're going to bring them through, ask all the questions, kind of build a business case that ultimately you're going to take to management. All these time and effort and cost to kind of build that process have to be expensed. You don't get to capitalize any of these costs, okay? The next stage is called your application development stage. This is where you're designing your software, you're going to be coding it, you're building it. If you actually decide to build this on-prem in your own data center, the cost to go buy that hardware and install it, those costs are capitalizable. And then if you're going to do any kind of testing, as you rolled your old system and run it parallel with your new one, those testing costs are also capitalizable. Most of the costs in here are capitalizable, not all, and we can talk about some of the things, and we will talk about some of the things that are not. And then you have your post-implementation operation stage. You've moved it into production, and you're going to have your deployment costs, training costs for employees how to use it, any kind of maintenance to upkeep on it, any kind of the supporting team that has to take the questions. All of those costs have to be expensed. So that's starting to get a glass of water here, sorry. Okay. So when does capitalization start? Well, first and foremost, the preliminary project stage has to be completed. The business requires you to have that diligence done, so you got to get through that stage. Then you also have to make sure you have the appropriate level of management given that authorization. And then you also have to make sure the project will be completed and it's going to be intended to use. You can't go off and start capitalizing all these costs, knowing all well you're just going to mothball it and stick it on a shelf forever. You can't do that. You have to kind of have a business intent that what you're going to build is ultimately going to be used by the company. Now, one thing I want to kind of go back on is this management authorization. This is going to be based on your CapEx policy, your capital expenditure policy. Especially in an Agile world, you're going to want to make sure you get this authorization. I'm going to call this out numerous times today, and you probably think I'm forgetting to tell you, but I'm just trying to really drill this point in. It's really important because of how easy it is to access it today with the cloud, and developers can go build these applications today. You really want to make sure you have this authorization so you can go to your internal audit groups or your external auditors and say, yes, this has been authorized to go work on this work. You have to have that in place. Now, when does it stop? Well, it stops when the project is substantially completed and you've done your substantial testing. And the accountants were quite specific in using the word substantially. They didn't use 100% complete because they don't want someone to be kind of cute and say, well, I got 2%, I'm so close, and so I'm going to continue to capitalize these costs, into perpetuity. They use the word substantially. So when you're pretty much done, you're done. And then also when it's ready for its intended use. So this is kind of when you stop capitalization and you move into the next stage. So here, if you think about it, let's go back to SOP 98-1, came out in 1998. That's over about 20 years. That's 20 years ago, right? And so think back then what was happening. The Agile Manifesto wasn't signed until 2001, right? So when the accountants reached out into the industry and said, hey, how do you guys do this software development? And they all said, we do waterfall. And they said, okay, we'll build our accounting model to line up with what you guys are doing. So if you look, they have your requirements analysis, kind of lines up with the preliminary project. Then you have your application development lines up with your coding and your verification. And then when you move it into deployment and maintenance, that's the post-implementation operation. Kind of lines up quite well. They kind of had their 3 stages, kind of lines up with the overall process of waterfall. Now again, I want to highlight, you can't cross over this boundary until you get that management authorization, until you get that due diligence phase done. Can you move into that? So this is based on waterfall. So now when people move into an agile world, yes?
Do they have to commit to the specific work? That specific work.
What do you mean by that?
So you can commit to funding in different ways. You can fund no matter what the work is, or you can fund based on the particular product.
Well, so from a waterfall perspective, which this was originally kind of based on, you're going to have your overall project was kind of built. This is my requirements. This is the team that I think is going to be building it. Here's my plan, right? So it's kind of based on a plan. When you move to an agile world, it's going to be different, right? So you're going to say, here's my team that I'm going to fund. And so that's where some people say, well, wait a minute, it's been based on a waterfall methodology. I probably can't capitalize these costs because the accounting model doesn't say you can. And so
you can't. Is it specific guidance that says you must X before?
Well, here's the magic formula. This is the next slide. Here's the magic formula. So you can point your finance and accounting breath into ASC 350-40-55-4. And what it says is, it doesn't matter. It's the nature of the cost, not entirely its timing that matters. So no matter what the activities are happening under a waterfall methodology or an agile methodology, as long as you're doing these certain types of activities, you can capitalize those activities. So they call this out specifically. Not only that, in the actual accounting literature, it says they even talk about when people are coding and testing concurrently, which is a direct shout out to those in the agile space. So the accountants are full aware that this exists and you can capitalize these costs, okay? And so the key thing though is you have to make sure you're tracking everything very down to the detail. You gotta make sure what you're doing. You can't be loosey-goosey about it, you gotta kinda know what you're doing. Now again, broken record, once your preliminary project stage is completed, okay? So what does that kinda look like? Well, you just can't, because like one of the things you do is you're going to say, I'm just going to capitalize a pool of time. You can't just say, well, I'm going to have all these developers, they're working, and I'm going to capitalize that just as one big lump. You can't do that. You have to track, because what you're ultimately capitalizing is features, the actual functional software. That's what you're trying to track, because that has value to the company. So that's what I'm talking about, the activities and how you do that. Okay?
How about from the testing perspective?
Testing is capitalizable, as long as it's happening in the application development. So that's one of the things we'll talk about. Once you kind of move out of application into production, and you're like, uh-oh, that now all those activities have to be expensed because you've already moved it into production. So that's a pitfall that we want to make sure we avoid. Okay, so here we have more of a view of under an agile. It's not a waterfall. And so you're going to have your preliminary project. You're going to want to make sure you're doing your conceptual formulation, go through that buy versus build. But hey, we're going to start building software. The time we spent on each of these activities will be much different, right? Because when you're doing a waterfall, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out every single requirement possible. Versus when you're doing agile, you're going to be working with the business every 2 weeks or every month, sharing what you're doing and getting those new requirements. I like this, I don't like this. So time spent within a waterfall versus agile will be quite different, okay? So you'll do your preliminary as project, and again, the expenses that are incurred, activities are expense as incurred. You get that green light, you got that approval from management, you got your CAR, your capital acquisition approval, right? And then authorization, and then you move into application development. So depending if you're using Scrum, your 2-week sprints, you're releasing, depending if you're going to do releases to the business very frequently, or if you're deciding to kind of do it more of on an epic basis, that will determine how long you're spending within application development versus moving it into production. So that's something you want to make sure your teams are kind of focused on. And then ultimately, when you move it into deployment and the maintenance, those costs, those activities, once again, are expensed. All right? So here are some, now this is within internal use software. here are some things that I want to make sure you some gotchas or some things to kind of think about. Within internal use software, overhead and general and administrative costs are expense as incurred, and that's no matter what stage those happen. So we'll talk about overhead under software to be sold methodology has a different treatment. Business process engineering. So generally some people will maybe do a big effort on an ERP system, right? You're going to re-engineer how you do things, your procurement to pay process, your orders to cash or quote to cash. Those processes that you're going to re-engineer, all those costs have to be expensed. That's not something you get to capitalize. When you're actually working on training and you're creating this content and you're going to deliver it to your employees, even if you're doing it during the application development stage, all those costs have to be expensed. Now you're saying, wait a minute, I'm making this investment. Well, you're investing in your employees. And while employees are a company's #1 asset, you don't own an employee, right? They can work somewhere else. So although you're investing in them, they take that knowledge with them, and so you don't get to capitalize any of those costs. They have to be expensed. And then any kind of data conversion, you're going to move information from one system to another. All that labor and all that effort to move it over has to be expensed. And then bug fixes. This is one of the pitfalls you want to avoid, is you don't want your developers in such a hurry to move code out and have this release. Because if you're working on the code, and it's happening during the application development, you're coding and you're testing it, and you're fixing stuff, you can continue to capitalize those costs. If you move it out into production and you have a bug fix, you're like, uh-oh, that didn't work. Then any types of those costs thereafter is also expensed. You don't get to capitalize that. So that's why it's really important to kind of track those activities.
So you're talking about bug fixes, boundary stuff, like bugs that were actually post-implementation?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you find something in error while you're thinking, and just part of that within the actual development process, those costs can be fixed and not capitalized.
Does it matter whether you track them as bugs or not?
It will under this alternative methodology, the features completed method that I'll be talking about. You do want to track those.
Okay.
Okay. So let's talk about items that you can capitalize, or for some of the things I would like to highlight. So no matter in what stage you buy, if you buy a third-party license, those costs can be capitalized. Okay, so even if you're buying it in your preliminary, your post-implementation, wherever you buy a third-party license, because there's value to the company, it's an asset and you've paid money for that, you can capitalize that.
Including subscription you mean, or is it only if you buy the software as a purchase?
For subscriptions, it depends on there's some new guidance coming out on that. Some people treat those more of like a prepaid asset. So, and depending how long the subscription agreement is, if you're doing Salesforce and it's month to month to month, maybe like a prepaid rent, some companies are just going to expense that. If it's an annual contract, depending on how the license is treated, you may bifurcate that and record a license and then record a right to use. So there's some interesting rules on that specific part of it. But we're talking more about the historic licenses back in the day, those type of licenses, not subscriptions. Okay?
So in general, which option is better for companies, capitalizing or expense?
That's a good question. So we'll talk about there's pros and cons. If you overcapitalize, you may be undernourishing. That's part of that 20% discussion. So if you can just table that, but that's a good question. And so because you don't want to be, that's a pitfall. You want to make sure there's balance. And not in life, there's always balance. Because when we're talking about capitalizing costs, you don't get to like capitalize and they're forgotten. They come back, right? So if you're overzealous and you want to be too aggressive, you have to pay the piper, as we say. Sometimes the bill will be due at some point.
So in looking at the list here, it would appear that all of the activities that take place inside of a standard sprint cycle, if you will,
Yep.
are capitalizable, if that's a word.
Yep, it is.
Okay, so there's no, you're not aware of any exceptions in the standard model, that all of the activities pretty much can be capitalized?
Pretty much. There's a couple nuances I'm going to touch on.
Okay.
So there'll be a couple things that are not on the list, but I'll point out.
Okay.
But as long as you're doing these activities, that's why it's again within Agile, as long as you're doing the activity and you're tracking it,
I would have guessed sprint planning would have fell outside. I was surprised to see.
But just because you're designing the software, and designing is part of application development
Okay.
for internal use,
Yeah.
okay?
So content conversion coding would fall under capitalized, but the actual running of doing the data conversion itself would not?
So if you're going to, I may have misunderstood, but I'll say this, and if I'm not right, because you said content, but if you're, the actual process of converting software from one system to another has to be expensed. If you build a tool that allows you to convert your data, that process of building that new bridge or tool is capitalizable. Or if you buy an off-the-shelf tool license, that's also capitalizable.
Right.
We'll talk about website, because you said the word content, maybe that's a little bit different, but we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, I was talking about like a tool, like you described.
Okay, all right.
Building a new tool.
That's what I
bridge.
Okay, so I wasn't 100% sure, but that's what I thought you said.
Yep.
Sorry for slowing you down too much. I do not see the review unless readiness review is the sprint review.
We have the sprint review, so that's one of the things is one of the things on the list.
All right.
So, but I'll bring that up. So, okay. So we talked about licenses, converting software. You can capitalize that. Sprint planning, you can capitalize that because you're planning the design of your software. Retrospectives, as long as you're learning to say how we're going to do it better, because it's really about building the software, that time can be. Now a sprint review, okay, it's a potential pitfall. If it's a pure demo, you're just showing the business, no. Okay, that time spent. If it's truly, there's collaboration, there's things that are happening in that time where you're spending. This is, I've seen companies do both. But if on a sprint review, if there's true collaboration, new things, we're going to build this product, design it, kind of tweak and using some of that time to do that, yes. So it's nuanced.
So wait, so does that mean if you're showing it off and receiving feedback that...
You may have to bifurcate your time in that meeting if you want to get that granular. So some people say, I don't, yes.
And actually altering the design as a result of the review? During the review, it's okay? Or what do you mean by that?
Well, how about, this? We're getting pretty granular on some of that. How about, I have my business card, happy to talk, but, I just don't want to get, if you don't mind. The other thing is Scrum Masters. So this is a pitfall you want to make sure you avoid. Some companies look at the Scrum Master. Yeah. Okay. So Scrum Master, some people look at the Scrum Master as two ways. One is it's an administrative function, right? They're just purely overhead. I just need them as part of the team. And so that's an administrative, that's G&A. And we said G&A costs have to be expensed. On the flip side, some people say a Scrum Master is inherent to the overall software development. This role is so important because they knock out all the impediments, make sure things happen, and so their time and their involvement is key. I get to capitalize those costs. So you want to make sure, depending how material your Scrum Masters are within your organization, you check with your internal finance, and if it's material, go talk to your external auditors of how they're going to view Scrum Masters. I've seen it both ways. You can make a case either way, so it just depends. And we're talking about these costs about capitalization. The main thing we're talking about is the labor cost, right? It's that people cost. So this is going to be their salaries. This is going to be kind of the fringe benefits, right? The payroll taxes, life insurance, whatever those fringes are. Those type of costs we're capitalizing. Third-party consultants and contractors, those costs we're going to be capitalizing. One thing is travel. If you're traveling for various on engagements to kind of go to these sites, those costs can be capitalizable. One of the things, though, is additional functionality, right? So ultimately, if we're going to be working on some software that's already existing, and we're just going to enhance it or improve it, and it's just going to extend its useful life, that rework is expensed, because it has to be creating new functionality for that software. You really have to kind of do something. It's got to be a new gizmo, right? Something a little bit, take it up a notch to qualify for that next round. Again, you have to make sure you have the appropriate level authorization and gone through your preliminary to say, hey, I have this existing thing. I want to take it from 2.0 to 3.0. And you have to make sure you're getting that management authorization to spend that money to say, yep, we'll make that investment, all right? So we spent a lot of time talking about internal use, and I think most companies have internal IT departments. You have these groups, and so a lot of folks are going to have that software internal development. A lot of people shouldn't be doing that today, so it should be consistent. To be sold, right? This is what we said. This is Microsoft and the Oracles of the world. Software's eating the world, right? Technology is being pervasive. A lot of companies are going to be involved. If not, when, right? It's not a matter of if they're going to, it's just a matter of when they're going to be getting into software. Think of how much change is happening. Think about like in Tesla and what's going on in transportation. I mean, they automatically increase the speed of their cars through a software update. You had BMW did 260 updates to its various systems through software in 2017 alone. Right? Think of what's gone on in our mobile phones. We have handheld computers now. So there's going to be substantial changes that all of us at our business models are going to be impacted. And I think it's one of the reasons why I want to cover to-be-sold software, because there's accounting implications that we'll talk about as well. So getting a good understanding is important. So we're going to go back in our time machine. Instead of 1998, we're going to go to 1986, which is when unusually, or maybe coincidence, is FASB 86, the original pronouncement came out. And in 1986, I'm still in high school, I had a desktop. I had a Texas Instrument, right? And there wasn't laptops around. And so in 1986, software was cutting edge, right? I mean, the accountants looked at it and it was cutting edge kind of stuff going on. And so they took a research and development model. And research and development says, all this time and effort to kind of build whatever you're going to do, this is maybe in pharmaceuticals or whatever back in the day, this R&D, research and development, you have to expense those costs. So all that time you're going to spend planning, designing, coding, even testing that software, expensed. You get no value out of that. Not until you reach what they called technological feasibility. And so for them, it's a detailed program design. This is what they define it as well as a working model. In industry, generally, it's going to be after you complete your alpha release. So when you complete your alpha release and start your beta, all the way up until your general release, all those costs can be capitalized. And they're capitalizable so long as they're recoverable, which means you have to have a sales plan. You can't be building this software and there's no market for it, so then you can't capitalize these costs. You have to believe someone's going to want to buy your software up to these costs. So that's what they mean by recoverable. Now, we said under internal use, you can't capitalize overhead, but under to be sold, you can. When we talk about overhead, we're talking about the building that your software development engineers are working in, so you can capitalize the depreciation, the heating and the cooling of it, the utility bills, the tax bills on it. If you're actually going to go get hardware for this to run on, you get to capitalize that depreciation for that hardware. Your cloud computing expenses, if you're going to run into a cloud, you can capitalize those costs all the way up until the point you GA your product or release it into the market. Now, under either model, general administrative costs have to be expensed. And then once you've kind of released this product out into the market, any kind of maintenance, the support team, again, those costs very similarly are expensed. So that's to be sold, and there's a pitfall you want to avoid here, which is about reaching this technological feasibility. And so you want to make sure your high-risk issues have been resolved. And when we talk about high risk, this is going to be things that are novel, unique, kind of that cutting-edge stuff that you're a pioneer going to new things. Because if you started this process for capitalizing these costs, and you haven't really addressed this high-risk item, and it comes up later, all the costs that you capitalized have to be written off immediately, expense them all, and the cost to fix that problem have to be expensed as well. And so the accountants were wanted really to make sure you really know that you're done before going on and capitalizing it, because when you have a write-off, that does what? It's earnings volatility. And accountants and Wall Street and your investors and other stakeholders don't like volatility in the income statement. And so that's why they were quite clear, and it's a pitfall you want to avoid, is you want to make sure all your coding and testing is done before you say, I'm good, I'm going to start capitalizing my costs. All right? So we've talked about the main method, these two accounting models. And then, of course, along the way, there's various methods to track these costs. Historically, we have time tracking, which is people going into a system, putting their time in. And the other way is story points, right? This is where you take your cost, figure out the cost per story point for your teams, and you capitalize the amount of points. So we're going to break into, do a table exercise. So this is what I came up with, being just the finance kind of guy. So time tracking aligns with current practices, right? Everyone kind of, your finance people, your auditors, everyone kind of knows what that is. And then it should be intuitive, right? They've already been, if you're historically from waterfall, you're putting time into a system anyway. So if you move into Agile, just keep doing what you're doing, guys and gals. Just keep on typing it in. Cons are, it's going to impact your productivity, which we talked about. So the more accurate you want to get this down to the minutia, it's going to slow the overall Scrum process, right? So you're going to have to do a trade-off. Either you're going to be super productive, and then you're going to have inaccuracy, or you're going to be super accurate and you're going to have to impact your productivity. So that's the trade-offs that people have to weigh. And of course, if you're the finance folks, I'd rather have it, just make sure you're doing it, because I know I can rely on hours and hours. On the story points, as we talked about, there's higher correlation to its team's effort. So we talked about, people said this is what they completed in this 2-week period. And so these points said, I can capitalize it. It kind of ties out. And then it's already there, as we talked about. People have the data, we're tracking it. So it's really why story points are a good way to do it. Then on the con side, story points are subjective. Each team, there could be differences very easily of team to team to team. At my previous company that I worked at, our internal IT department was based on silos. Towers is what we call them. So we had the finance tower, the legal tower, your marketing, your sales, engineering. And so all those IT folks had a leader, and they all kind of reported up into that. And so there was such disparity from tower to tower to tower, they just couldn't get a harmonization amongst the various teams. And so we had to just stick with timekeeping. So we just couldn't get everyone on the same page to say, okay, this is what the value is. And so ultimately, this was just 2 years ago, they may have changed, but they were stuck with that. And then also there's estimation. As part of this estimation, this is one of the pitfalls you want to avoid. So there was a study in 2013 by the Electric Group, and they went off and polled over 1,100 participants of people that worked in software development, And this included people from GE, Intuit, Samsung, so some big companies of people that were part of this process. And they came up with, how much idle and wait time do you have? How much time are you kind of just not doing what we pay you to do? And this is the average, was 39%. 39% of the time, people are not doing coding. They're not really developing my software that I'm asking them to do. And that's a pretty big number. And so a pitfall you want to avoid when you're creating your story points as part of this process is you got to figure out how much of your time is doing non-coding work. And you have to come up with this estimate. Interesting enough, the University of Cambridge, they also did a study, much smaller population, and they came up with 50% of wait and idle time. At my previous company, we had come up with 40%. So we were average. So again, it's a pitfall you want to make sure you avoid. Make sure you have the time tracking and how there's historical data to support, of this overall time that our teams are doing. I have to carve this off because I know there's just some unproductivity that's going to be in my overall story points. Yep.
Was this regardless of method used?
It didn't say. That didn't come out when I read it. That didn't say. But and this is 2013, so it may be a little bit more waterfall based. I know in my previous company we were half and half depending on the project, so we were hybrid. Not all the teams were this, so that may have been the reason why we were average. So, okay. So one of the things I'd like to share with you is this features completed alternative. And what this does, it looks at on a team by team basis, versus trying to get harmony across everybody about story points, is look at each individual team and the actual work that that team completed. You'll have to do some configuration to your application lifecycle management systems, your ALM. You'll also need to do some upfront planning. So the program manager that's determining your various stories, you need to figure out the type of work that each of the teams is going to be working on. You know, is it going to be adding new functionality? Is it just an enhancement? Is it going to be a bug fix? So these upfront attributes need to be kind of programmed into your ALM. If you need help with that, you know, I have some contacts you could reach out to. But anyways, this is the kind of upfront planning. And I thought the best way to explain it is really through just an example, and then we can go from there. So we're going to have Team A and Team B, 2 teams. There's 6 people on each team. And interesting enough, everybody on the team all makes $100,000, including benefits. It just worked out that way. So it's $600,000 per team, okay? Pretty simple math. And every 4 months, they're going to do an epic release. They're going to release their code every 4 months, okay? They've done their electric cloud analysis, and they said, okay, we're better than average. 25% of our time is idle and wait time. So 25% or 1/4 of $600,000 for each team. You take that off the top, it's $150,000, 1/4 of 600, okay? So your maximum capitalizable that you could ever do from here on out is $450,000. That's the maximum that you can do. Any questions? Is that, okay, we have 2. All right.
That's if they work on a project, right?
Say again?
They don't split their time on anything else, any other project, one focused project.
Right, there's the maximum they can focus for, let's say for the rest of the whole year, that's the maximum dollar amount, because 600,000, we took off the idle wait time that we've determined, 450, sorry, is the maximum amount. Got it?
So idle wait time isn't necessarily just idle time, but it's like staff meetings and one-on-ones and things like that.
Yeah, G&A, yeah.
Yeah, any administrative type stuff. Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to move into Team A. So Team A, they have their ALM system. They're able to track, say, okay, this is the amount of work that they did. They used their own point system. And so if you look at it, their new functionality that they determined, they have the approval and all that, and it's 320 points out of the 800. Okay? And so 320 divided by 800 is 40%. And we said they're a 4-month release. They worked on this code over 4 months. So 1/3 of the maximum 450. So 1/3 of that time is $150,000, right? And then 40% of that $150,000 for those 4 months of time and effort is $60,000. That's what they're able to capitalize, because the bug fixes, those that they worked on, because we're agile, we're kind of continuously working on code. Bug fixes and enhancements, because they only extend the useful life, are not capitalizable. This is new functionality. It's kind of that 2.0 to 3.0, right? New stuff that they worked on, okay? So they were able to capitalize this team, Team A, 60,000 of the cost. Make sense? Okay. Similarly, Team B. These guys just do things their own way. They beat their own drum. We don't like the Fibonacci scale. We have something that works for us. So over the same 4 months, instead of the 800 normal story points you would have, we have 100. Just because they're unique, they like to do it different. This works for them. This is the way they are. So they had pulled from their backlog was 50 points of capitalizable work, new functionality, and then the other 50 points were bug fixes and just enhancements. Just didn't create anything new. So about 50 points out of 100, 50% of their time was building new code, stuff that we want. And then, so same capitalizable base, the 450 for 4 months, that's 1/3 of that. So 1/3 of 450 is 150. And we capitalize 50% of the 150, or $75,000. Okay? So, when you line the 2 teams up, this is what we talked about, is Team A made 800 story points, of which 320 were true new functionality stuff. And so if you had done a cost per story point, right, and you would have X dollars kind of capitalized, is much different on team B when the story points are much different. So if you can't get harmonization amongst your organization across to say we're all going to do story points the same way and kind of assign the value the same way, you can use this methodology. And there may be this AVC that I'm not familiar with. So that I don't know.
It's accepted value costing.
Accepted? Okay, that I'm not familiar with. So that's something new. You may want to look into that as well. Maybe there's 4 alternatives.
It looks very similar to that.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Except that they didn't take into consideration the capitalization, which is what you're focusing on.
That's the most important part, I think. But
Right?
being the finance guy, that's what matters.
No, it occurred to me yesterday in listening to their presentation, I was like, oh my gosh, but what about the CapEx? Because not all the activities within the feature, yeah.
So if you have your ALM system running and you assign attributes for these features and you're saying it's these type of categories, you got your upfront program managers, they're doing the story points, say this, they're going to do this, this is this, this is this, and then you can dump it all into Excel, do your sorting, your filtering. You can easily track this information team by team by team, and then now your teams love you. You don't have to use your time tracking anymore. So this is an alternative for you all to consider. So just thought I would share that. But it allows you to see is if you just based on story points, these no good team B's only 50 points, I can't capitalize nothing. But truly they did some pretty quality work. So just it's an alternative to consider versus just those the standard 2 of story points and time tracking. All right? Okay. Now, we've talked so much about capitalizing these costs. Kind of, eventually you got to pay the piper, right? You defer costs for a certain period of time. And so when you capitalize the cost, if it's a hard asset, and we're talking like a building, a plane, a car, that's a capital asset. And so when you ratably take that charge into your income statement, it's called depreciation expense. Because software is an intangible asset, that's why we call it amortization expense. The concepts are the same because you're taking a part of that overall cost that you expended cash day one, and we're putting that into our P&L or income statement, profit and loss, over a period of time. You just have different terminologies, but they're non-cash charges, depreciation, amortization, okay? Now, of course, us accountants, we couldn't keep it simple. We have 2 different methodologies. So for internal use, amortization begins when the software is ready for its intended use, and substantial testing has been completed. See, they like that word substantial, which means even you can't just leave a couple percent, a little bit where I'm not really going to test that just yet. No, it's substantial. And then it begins when the software is ready. So you may have all that software done, but I haven't trained my employees yet. Well, it doesn't matter. Your software is ready to go. You need to start amortizing it. But I had this rollout. Doesn't matter. You got to kind of start amortizing it. Now, if you have 2 modules that are dependent on each other, for some reason this one and this one kind of work together, those you can wait until both are able to work, and then you can amortize those together. All right. Now, within internal use, what they use is called the straight line methodology, which means you figure out how long the software is going to last, and then you take an equal amount over this period of time. So if it's a 4-year life, you're going to do it over 48 months. Every month you take 1/48 of the cost. Now in Agile space, there's 2 ways your teams can do it. You can kind of do it on a release basis, or you can kind of do it on an epic basis. If your teams like to kind of release code on a pretty frequent basis into production for your company to use, you may want to use the release method. So the team's done their two sprints, 1 month of work. They release the code into production, and you determine that software they're working on is 48 months. Then the next 2 sprints, another month is done, and you release that, and it's that same kind of related software. You don't start a new clock in 48 months. You're going to amortize that over 47 months. And another month later, 46 months to kind of catch up. So that overall, and generally you're only going to do this for things maybe 2 or 3 months at a time. Sorry. If you move on to an epic, you're saying, okay, I have this software. I'm going to do it every 4 or 6 months, and I'm going to assign a 4-year life. And then the next 4 or 6 months, I got the new code. It may have 3, 4, or 5 years, whatever you determine that to be. I'm going to amortize it over that. So there's 2 different ways as you release your code into production, depending on how you want to go do that. All right? Now, you can kind of see, as we talked about, we have our capitalization. We're kind of moving through, and then once we kind of move from application into the post-implementation operation stage, that's when the clock starts and you start amortizing your intangible asset. Okay? Now, to be sold, different story. Yep.
Sorry, I had to review teachers, but I didn't want to interrupt. So you said ethics, can it apply to any bucket regardless of which it is? Does it have to be?
It's just under philosophy of how those teams want to do it. So I think if people do frequent releases, and they're saying, and this only is a batch, you may want to do it on the release and just kind of catch it all up. But you don't get a new clock for each release. That's the one thing is like, because they're going to have this mishmash anyways, and your accounting folks will probably pull their hair out. But then if you have this big chunk of software, they've been working on it for 4 or 6 months, it's an epic. Okay, let's define that with a 4-year. And then maybe the next epic, 3 years, or 5, whatever determined. Software I've seen is 2 years. I've seen people up to 7, maybe 10. But I think in this day and age, software, so much is happening. To go out to 10 years, that's a lifetime.
That's billable.
Huh? Who's that? The dinosaurs out there. Okay. So, of course, the accountants had to have a different methodology for to be sold. And what you do is you look at it on a product-by-product basis, and then you look at that individual product's revenue in relation to its overall sales plan. Okay? Now, here's a pitfall you want to avoid, is you don't want to have an overzealous sales plan and try to be cute. Like, you know what, I'm going to make this big sales plan and just have a little bit of amortization expense, each month or each quarter that I report. Because ultimately, the accountants require you that if you have to do an evaluation of that intangible on your balance sheet to make sure it's not been adversely impacted. So you have to write it down to its net realizable value. And what that means is you need to look at your sales plan. So here's a good example was, Microsoft in October 2012 came out with Windows 8. Hey, our friends over at Apple have the iPhone, and this stuff is really taking off. All this mobile operating system, we need to make our OS, for mobiles too. So they came out with Windows 8. Fast forward 18 months, April 2014, Microsoft comes out and says, sales price down 70% on Windows 8. We're going to reduce the price that much, 70%. Now, I didn't work at Microsoft, and you can't look in their financials. I mean, it's such a big organization. But I can pretty well guarantee that in their sales plan, they didn't come up with a 70% decrease in their sales price. Otherwise, you'd be shot, right? So I guarantee they had to have a big write-down. And they had probably had an uh-oh moment internally because they probably had an overzealous sales plan, and so they had to catch up and have a big write-off. So you don't want to have uh-ohs with your internal stakeholders. Yep.
Is that an overzealous sales plan or just bad product?
Are they any different? That's a good question. I don't know. They're maybe tied together? I don't know. Yeah. So, but right, you can start from the market research. The market research, was it under not executing? There's multiple things there. Maybe they missed the ball because, exactly. Whatever the accountants say, you got too much on the balance sheet capitalized. You're going to have to write that off now. But they're so big, I couldn't find that number. I was looking around, I couldn't find it. So
I have a question.
sure.
For the to be sold, since you're having to wait until you have an actual product, that could be multiple, number of releases. So that release model we talked about, or cadence of just none of that, anything you move up and set it into prod, those releases, you would have to wait until that product.
So to be sold, yeah. So to be sold in an Agile space is you may not want to be releasing out to the general release to the public, every month, right? You may want to, because some people, now like my iPhone, I'm getting releases, all these apps are all over the place. I'm getting updates all the time. But if you're truly selling it for money, a license, you're probably not going to be releasing it. That's why generally we have the 2.0, the 3.0 every 2 years, right? And so they're probably capitalizing all those costs during this period of time because they've gone from that alpha release and the beta they're testing with some certain customers. Oh, you get behind the curtains.
Still kind of team level, whatever model you're following, if you're doing the story points, you would still be collecting that capitalization on the balance sheet until you could get to a point where a product is
released for to be sold. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So again, there's a gotcha for there. Okay, so this lines up the two software capitalization models. You have internal use, to be sold. Here's when you can capitalize. Here's when you stop, and here's when you amortize. So this kind of lines it up as a one-stop shop. Now, what may not jump off at the page at you, it's really kind of, it impacts some of the things we'll talk about, is under a to-be-sold model, the R&D, right? The trial and error of coding, designing, testing, all that has to be expensed. Versus internal use, we don't know what we're doing exactly. We're going to kind of play around, right? We're going to spend some of this time trying to figure it out. You get to capitalize those costs. So that's just something to kind of consider depending, and that's really going to be big as people kind of move into these cloud environments, right?
If you start out internal use and then later find out it's sellable?
Yes, good question. So the question was if you have a product and you say, hey, wait a minute, I'm using internally, but now if you have the intent to begin with out the gate that you're going to do that, then you can't capitalize the costs, right? But if you later, your intent was internal, but maybe customers kind of bump into it or whatever, and you're like, hey, I kind of like this. What you do then, so you've had all these capitalized costs for internal use, you then start selling, so you don't get the revenues until you work all that cash that you're getting from customers, work down that intangible asset.
So you don't get any realized revenue until that's gone?
Yes. Okay. Accountants are smart. They thought about that. Okay. So let's circle back to the impact of the cloud. This is a study done by Cisco, and it talks about the installed workloads and in compute instances. And when I kind of look at it, for me, I'm eyeballing it. It's 2017 that we just kind of finished last year. And I get about 200 million, give or take. I mean, we're splitting hairs, about how many instances are in the market. And then by 2019, like we talked about, where the businesses are able to swipe their credit cards, half the business users are going out and procuring technology on their own. I get to about 350 million. It's kind of eyeballing it. So it's about 75% increase over the next 2 years. That's kind of the explosive growth. And it's really kind of looked at the green bar, which is your software as a service, right? This wedge going up to that wedge. And so there's a lot of companies, because of the cloud, it's caused some other things going on within digital transformations. And a digital transformation is taking your existing business and kind of digitizing it to create new revenue sources or new ways to interact with your existing customers. And so these digital transformations, MIT came out and said companies that have gone through a digital transformation are 26% more profitable and have a 12% higher market cap than those that have not done a digital transformation. And there's got to be people within your executive team that are aware of these studies and these things. And so I guarantee a lot of people are thinking about it, your CEO, your chief strategy officer, or what have you. Now there's some additional things that came out with Altimeter, came out in October of 2017 last year. And they went off and did a survey. And they figured that 37% of the companies that they polled had used this digital transformation, had said they're going to be proactive, and had that aha moment. And they went, aha, we're going to be proactive and we're going to change our business. As an example of that was Domino's. Domino's has hired 400 software development engineers and other analysts to look at how they deliver pizza, what we're going to do, right? So they're looking at autonomous vehicles to deliver the pizzas. They're looking at mobile ovens. They're looking at drones to kind of drop the pizzas off. I mean, that's how you can digitize their business. Someone originally had signed up for this class. I don't know if someone from Domino's is actually here, but no? Okay. Or, on the other side, you have people going, uh-oh. And there were 17% of companies that had been surveyed and said, uh-oh, they've already felt a degradation to their business. So they're already behind the curve. This is back in October. Now, by a raise of hands, whose company is in an aha moment that your company is right now going through a digital transformation? Just 1, 2, 4, 5? Huh? Kinda. You're thinking about it, you're working on it. Okay. Is anyone willing to say on your company's on the uh-oh and you're like, we got 1, 2, 3, okay. Does anyone want to share either the ahas or the uh-ohs of what you're kind of going through and some of those struggles? Positive or negative?
For us, I mean, it seems to be the age-old, it costs money. And it takes resources to explore, to evaluate, to whatever. And the money doesn't exist. Or it's not being made available. The executive team is just not willing to invest.
Even when you may have missed this slide, even if you have I'll be 26% more profitable. My market cap will be 12% higher than the next guy.
I'm not a CPA, but I think about it at least 3 times a week going, WTF, I mean, what?
We're going to be left behind. Okay.
I don't know.
Well, here's some more fodder for you. I'll give you some more fodder. Is anyone have any more sharing? I'm sorry. Yeah?
Well,
There we go.
Like,
Loud and proud.
I always get confused about how, I'm not a developer, I'm not in software development. Well, I'm on the other side, more like business side,
Okay.
correct? So what I see, in my past experience, when I used to work and do something, it used to cost much less. When I work our own IT and we develop something, to me, it's just like nothing. And it's like 100K. So that always bothers me. And I don't know what the breakdown is and where that cost goes.
So it's hard for you as a business person to say, I want to make that investment because I don't know what kind of return I'm going to get?
Yeah, I used to work for a software company.
Oh, okay.
The big software company, and I know, we used to develop software, and it used to be pretty, cheap. But now if I see on the other side, and if I see my big company that's not a software company, I go there and I see them developing a small application or something, even a package, it's like 100K or something, and I would say, oh my God.
It's the cost of the resources.
It's a labor
Yeah,
cost, yeah.
yeah.
So the resources are resources. If you go to the software company, like pure software company, the developer charges the same, correct? What makes it so expensive?
Not in so it's the cost of that resource overall. So it's, it's their salary, it's the benefits, it's the cost of business that goes into that model. But I totally understand what you're saying. Our owner said one time, I can go out and buy Microsoft Word, I forget how much it was at the time, for $250. But you're telling me I got to spend $100 grand to make a revision to our internal warehousing system. And you go, well, yeah, but Microsoft is going to sell how many billion copies of Word? So it can be $250. We're going to do this warehouse thing one time.
Year after year, we spend a lot of money, and I think if you go to costs, you buy something out of the shelf, it's much cheaper. Then, after 2 years, then, somebody wakes up and say, oh, cut the software, and they restart, okay, go ahead. Then the in-house software, they cut those too.
Right.
So we have spent so much money at the end of the day, I don't know if it's aha moment or those moment.
Well, there's definitely going to be trade-offs, right? So there's going to be buy versus build. But what's really the most impactful is what IDC came out in 2016. And their analysis says, with all the various industry groups that are out there, the top 20 in each, there's going to be 1/3 of them over the next 5 years are going to be impacted. And so when you think of the 80-20 rule, where your top 20 companies represent 80% of the revenue, that's substantial, right? In all the various industries. So you're talking 6 or 7 companies of these are going to have someone that are going to get their lunch eaten to them. And the words that IDC use, you need to transform or perish, right? It's not really optional. So while you may be thinking well, it's expensive, it's this, that, it's not a matter if someone's coming, they're coming. There's a lot of startups, a lot going out there. So here's a very historic company, Boeing, right? They took their historic analysis that they had on wings, engine fuel, the frames of the plane, all that stuff, and dropped it into that data into the cloud, put over artificial intelligence, augmented reality, big data, and they created a solution called disruption management that they're now selling as a service, offered as a service to the 300 global airlines. So here's this historic airplane company is now in the software space selling solutions. And they're selling that to the 300 global airlines. Because of course the airlines, if a plane is sitting there on the tarmac, you and I are upset. At the gate, we're upset. And they're not making money. They make money when the planes are flying. So if you can have a predictive analysis tool, such as Boeing just created, that's going to tell you when you need to say this plane needs the landing gear or wheels kind of squeaky or whatever, from predictive analysis, that's beneficial. So I think it's a brilliant idea, but that's how they've gone through and done their, as an example of a digital transformation. That's the kind of thing that's happening. All right? So what does that mean to us accounting folks? Well, we got more rules. So one is cloud computing on the cloud side, and that's under ASU, I better pick a space here, ASU 2015-05, and then website development, okay? Now on the cloud, this is really where you have to do some advanced planning, okay? The advanced planning is going to be both on how you contractually work with your customers and how you're going to go to business. So the to-be-sold software accounting has to be used if the customer can take possession of your software and do so without incurring a significant penalty. So if you have your software and you've built it and it's very transportable, so you can move it from, let's say you have it hosted in your own data center, but whatever reason, you can move it very easily to someone else's cloud, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, etc. And there's not a penalty to doing so. All those development costs to create your solution for your customer, let's say it was Boeing, and you knew you could make those requirements contractually and functionality, all that upfront cost had to be expensed. You don't get to capitalize that R&D thought process. But if for some reason you can't do it, either you didn't create the functionality or you did not contractually allow that without significant penalty, you can capitalize those costs as internal use. So that's why with this cloud environment and SaaS solutions, the accounting can make a big upfront, it can have a big impact, and you got to kind of plan ahead. That's the bottom line is you got to plan before you just start saying, well, I'm going to go do this or I'm going to do that. You got to kind of think about there are accounting ramifications to how that's treated. All right? And that's why you also need to know the two methodologies, the software to be sold and internal use. Boom.
Is this why I think you see a lot of software vendors trying to shift customers towards more of a cloud-based approach rather than buying it and installing it? Is it driven?
I don't think the accounting is driving. I think it's more people love the subscription base because it's just because the annuity of cash and the cash.
It's not so much accounting.
Because Wall Street loves recurring revenue sources.
Right.
Keep feeding that, I'll eat that all day long, right? Yeah, that's what it's about. All right, website development. So, of course, they couldn't stop with 3 stages. They had to do 5 for the website guys. So planning, all the time you plan your website, all that upfront expense. When you're developing your website, capitalize. When you move into your graphics development, when you're the initial part of developing your graphics for your website, you get to capitalize those. As well as if you make a substantial enhancement. Now, of course, that could be a gray area, so it could be a pitfall you want to avoid. But again, you can capitalize those. And then if it's ongoing maintenance of your graphics, expense those. The content, someone had a question, maybe this is what I thought you were confused, but the content of actually creating content for your website, all those costs are expensed. But if you create a pipe between your database and your website, again, it's kind of very similar to the internal use. If you create a pipe to talk the database and that, those costs could be capitalized, okay?
Is this only internal use website development, or is this both?
It's generally, well, depending because if it becomes if you're using your website to generate business, then you've moved into the to be sold.
Okay. So this would be your internal company website. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And then the last part, if you have upgrades and functionality, you're going to create Web 3.0 and some new gizmo and functionality to your website, as long as you get the approval in advance from your teams, very similar to internal use, you can capitalize those improvements after you've already deployed your website. All right. So this has become about the 20%. So there was Gartner came out in 2015 and did a study about what's the appropriate balance between of your amortization and depreciation. And so what they look is you look at your depreciation and amortization costs in relation to all of your IT spend, and a good balance is 20%. So if you have 10%, you may have underinvested previously, You may not do a very good job in capitalizing your costs, maybe too much wait time. Or you've just been a little bit behind the 8 ball. You have a very lackadaisical capitalization policy. One of the clients we worked with created such a high threshold to cap dollar spend, they just let everything go through. I mean, it was like $1 million for any individual project, which is, there's value there, right? But they just wanted to keep it simple for the accounting guys, which was interesting. On the flip side, if you have 30 to 35%, that means you may have been overzealous in your capitalization. You may have been capitalizing too much. And so now you may be unable to pivot while your new technologies are needed. You may have this burden, this technological debt, if you will, kind of burdening the company if you're 30 or 35%. So again, when we're talking about capitalization, you got to pay the piper at some point. You're deferring that cost to sometime in the future. With anything in life, you kind of got to have a balance, okay? And then the last thing, we have 5 minutes here, is the capitalization opportunity. So what this is, just something to take home, is so people that are generally in a waterfall environment, they are very project oriented, right? You're project to project to project. So you bring a team together, they work on a project, they work on it, get all the business requirements, complete the project 6 or 9 months later, and then they move on to the next project. Well, as they wait from project to project, you're going to have some of that idle and wait time as they build a new team and all that. If you move into more of an agile environment where you have dedicated teams that are consistently working together, so these become very well, norming, storming, all that stuff done. These are consistent teams that are working together, and they're really kind of feeding the organization, and by pulling from a well-documented, well-groomed backlog. And so they're consistently doing what we pay them to do, which is software development. So you're going to have to kind of go through a business transformation. You're going to have to reorganize your company to have these dedicated teams. But if you do that, you'll be able, because they're working more and more, you should be able to have a higher level of capitalization. So if you go through that business transformation, make sure you balance your mode 1 and your mode 2 work, and then you move from a project-based to a solution-based, and have these teams kind of focused on truly what's the end deliverable, which is value to the company, the software, you should be able to have a higher level of capitalization versus some of those companies in the waterfall that are project-based levels. So I know we've had a whole bunch of questions. It's now 2:40, and so we're out of time.
Will the deck be available?
I'm sorry?
Will your deck be available?
Yeah, I'll post that somewhere. I got to figure out how to do that.
Okay.
But I also have my business card here. Maybe Tom can help me out to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, we'll put it on SCAD, Rhonda. Well, everybody, we'll put it on SCAD, and you'll be able to get it out there.
Okay.
'Cause I saw people taking pictures. I have a PDF of it. You can definitely have it. It's 27 meg though. It's a big file.
So if you have some budget allocated, right?
Loud and proud?
Some budget allocated, like for a software company.
Okay, maybe. All right, thank you.